The Appalachian Scots-Irish are not really Scots-Irish. They never were. Modern DNA studies have taken samples from thousands of families in the deep mountain hollows, families that have been rooted in the Blue Ridge, the Cumberlands, and the Smokies for 10 or 12 generations. The genetic results are consistent, and they are startling. Nearly 60% of what we call Scots-Irish ancestry does not trace to Ulster at all. It traces to the northern English borderlands. The label itself, Scots-Irish, did not exist until the 1830s, and it was invented in America, not in Ireland. For 2 centuries, the mountains have been telling a story about themselves that the double helix has now quietly overturned. For generations, the traditional story was accepted as gospel. Every grandmother in every mountain hollow could trace the line back. It went like this. The suffering began in the north of Ireland, in the province of Ulster. Throughout the 1600s, the English crown had planted thousands of lowland Scots families onto confiscated Irish land. For a time, these settlers carved out a hard existence. Then, in the early decades of the 1700s, the ground shifted beneath them. Rents were racked to punishing levels by absentee landlords. English trade laws throttled their linen industry. A series of bitter winters and failed harvests pushed entire communities to the breaking point, and they were Presbyterians, legally barred from holding office, their marriages often deemed invalid by the established church. Between 1717 and the outbreak of the American Revolution, roughly 250,000 people abandoned Ulster. They packed into small wooden ships for a crossing that could last 10 to 12 weeks. They ate salted meat and hard biscuit. They buried their dead at sea. Most streamed into the port of Philadelphia, which quickly became their gateway to the unknown. From there, they turned their backs on the settled English Quaker lands of the East and pressed inland. They found the Great Wagon Road, an old Iroquois trade path that cut southwest through the Great Valley of Virginia. Family after family walked it, dragging carts and leading thin cattle, mile after rocky mile. They spilled into the unbroken backcountry, the Blue Ridge, the Cumberlands, the Smokies. They built log cabins in the hollows, planted corn among the stumps, and fought the Cherokee and Shawnee for every ridge. This was the Genesis story. It was passed down in kitchens and country churches. It was printed in school textbooks and mounted on museum walls. It was the tale of the rugged, independent Scots-Irish, and for 2 centuries it was accepted as the complete record of a people. But the story they told was not as old as the mountains themselves. The label Scots-Irish was an American invention. It did not exist in the old country. In Ireland, they were simply the Ulster Protestants, or the Presbyterians of the North. The hyphenated identity was forged on this side of the Atlantic, and it emerged for a very specific reason. In the decades after the American Revolution, a new wave of Irish immigrants began arriving. They were Catholic. They were fleeing poverty and famine. They came in staggering numbers, over 1 million by 1850. The earlier mountain settlers, whose families had been in the backcountry for generations, suddenly felt the need to draw a hard line. They were not these new Irish. They were something else entirely. And so the term Scots-Irish was deliberately adopted. It first appeared in print around the 1830s and gained traction through the 19th century. It distanced the mountain families from the crowded tenements and Catholic parishes of the eastern cities. It gave them a lineage that stretched back not to famine ships, but to the siege of Derry and the ancient Scottish clans. It was ancestry as a weapon, a way to claim a heroic, exclusive past in a nation that was rapidly changing. The story of the Scots-Irish was not just a family memory. It was a deliberate act of identity-making, carved out of the American soil. The tools to probe the inherited story finally arrived with the 21st century. In quiet population genetics laboratories, vials of spit became history books written in a language of A, T, C, and G. When researchers began mapping the Y chromosomes of men whose families had clung to Appalachian hollows for 10 generations, the results did not sing the old song. A major 2014 study pulled samples from deep-rooted families across the Blue Ridge and the Cumberland Plateau. The genetic signal that came back was not the expected imprint of Protestant Ulster. It pointed instead, squarely, to the ancient rain-soaked pastures of northern and western England. The English Midlands, the borderlands of Yorkshire, the remote fells of Cumbria, the stark, craggy counties that had dominated the Atlantic seaboard's earliest English settlements. The link to Ulster itself had been severed at the molecular level. The DNA revealed that the vast majority of these so-called Scots-Irish men carried markers prevalent not in the lowland Scottish transplants of the 1600s plantation, but in populations that had been rooted in English soil for over 1,000 years. The surname McDaniel often masked a deep English lineage. The name Vance hid a genetic trail leading to East Anglia, not to Ayrshire. The neat, satisfying tale of a single people pouring out of Ulster collapsed under the weight of the data. What emerged instead was a much messier, far older, and profoundly English migration, one that had been thoroughly hidden inside the very story meant to explain it. The paper archive told the same story once anyone bothered to read it carefully. The passenger manifests told the truth. Ship ledgers out of Liverpool and Whitehaven from the 1730s show thousands of surnames like Armstrong, Bell, Graham, and Elliot. But these families were not sailing from Belfast. They boarded in Cumbria. They boarded in Northumberland, the English-Scottish borderlands. Roughly 7 out of every 10 passengers who listed their point of origin gave a town in the border counties, not Ulster, Carlisle, Hexham, Jedburgh. These names appear again and again. Ireland barely registered. The land patent libraries of Virginia and Pennsylvania confirm the pattern. When a settler staked a claim along the Holston River or the Yadkin Valley, the clerk recorded their former residence. Time and again the entry reads, "Late of Cumberland, late of Westmoreland." The men and women walking the Great Wagon Road were not generations removed from lowland Scottish transplants. They were the immediate children of the border valleys. They had lived through the pacification of the River Country, the closing of the Moss Troopers' world, and they carried that memory straight into the Appalachian hollers. In most cases, Ireland was a brief way station for a minority, or bypassed entirely. The mountains were filled directly from the old marches. Despite this complex truth, the simpler Scots-Irish origin took hold and refused to let go. It was a story the mountains needed. When the rest of America looked down on Appalachia, labeling its people as poor white trash or inbred hillbillies, the Scots-Irish myth offered a shield. It said these were not the dregs of society, but descendants of warriors who had held the Anglo-Scottish frontier for centuries. It was a usable past, one that turned poverty into a badge of defiant independence. The label hardened in moments of regional crisis. During the Civil War, pro-Union mountain pockets in the South needed to distinguish themselves from their Confederate lowland neighbors. Claiming Scots-Irish roots, and thus a history of resisting tyranny, became a political statement. In the 1890s and early 1900s, as timber and coal booms stripped the hills and left deeper poverty and isolation, the myth served as a balm. It reframed hardship as ancestral stoicism, even when eugenicists in the 1920s targeted Appalachia as a breeding ground of degeneracy. The Scots-Irish narrative countered with an ancient noble lineage. School textbooks in Virginia and Tennessee codified it. Historians such as Theodore Roosevelt celebrated it in The Winning of the West. The story stuck because it had to. Without it, the region had only the labels others gave it. But the single origin story hid a much more complicated truth. The mountains had never hosted just one people. They had always been a mosaic. German Anabaptists from the Palatinate fled religious wars and arrived in the backcountry as early as the 1720s. They brought their plain dress, their pacifist faith, and their meticulous farming. Their family names, Brumbaugh, Garber, Studebaker, Weaver, Carpenter, dot the old cemetery stones in the Shenandoah Valley. Their surnames were quietly anglicized within 2 generations. Schmid became Smith, Zimmerman became carpenter, Weber became weaver. The German identity vanished from family memory, but the DNA remained. Modern studies find 20 to 30% Palatinate German ancestry across the deep Appalachian populations. That is nearly 1/3 of the mountain gene pool, and the school textbooks have effectively erased it. Welsh miners came too, drawn by the promise of coal and lead. They settled in pockets of what is now West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. Their hymns, their long vowels, and their knowledge of the deep earth became part of the hollows. Their story rarely made it into the textbooks. Free black families, some descended from indentured servants freed as early as the 1660s, moved westward, seeking land and distance from the Tidewater slave codes. In places like the Chestnut Ridge of Barber County, they built farms, raised families, and intermarried with their white and native neighbors. Entire communities such as the Melungeons emerged from this tri-racial mixing, and their origins were often deliberately obscured. Modern DNA studies find 3 to 8% sub-Saharan African ancestry across mountain populations that identify as white. It is small, but it is unmistakable, and it is present in far more families than the folk memory ever admitted. The Cherokee, who had called these mountains home for 1,000 years, did not simply vanish. Many remained hidden in the folds of the Blue Ridge after the Trail of Tears. Intermarriage was far more common than the simple story ever admitted. A Scots-Irish surname could easily mask a Cherokee grandmother. Modern DNA studies find real Native American ancestry in about 1 in 4 Appalachian families, at 4 to 10% average when it does appear, not enough to make everyone descended from Cherokee royalty, as folk memory claims, but real and consistent enough to matter. The clean, singular narrative was easier to remember. It was also a powerful tool for claiming a white, Protestant, pioneer identity. The German pacifist, the Welsh miner, the free black farmer, the hidden Cherokee, they were all erased, smoothed over by a story that demanded simplicity over truth. The simple story was not harmless. It calcified into a weapon. By the late 1800s, the Scots-Irish myth had birthed the hillbilly caricature, a figure of ridicule in urban newspapers, painted as violently independent, incestuous, and hopelessly backward. Cartoonists in New York and Boston gave him a slouched hat, a jug of moonshine, and a single snaggletooth. He sold papers. But the caricature soon escaped the funny pages. In the early 1900s, the eugenics movement seized upon the Appalachian body as proof of rural genetic decay. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924 was drafted in part by men who believed mountain whites were a degraded breed, their poverty a curse of bad blood. Dr. Walter Plecker, the state's first registrar of vital statistics, policed racial labels with obsessive zeal. If a birth certificate hinted at a single drop of non-white ancestry, he reclassified entire families, often erasing indigenous and African lineages in order to protect a fiction of pure white frontiersmen. Over 700 Virginia Indians were denied their tribal identity on paper. The myth's cost was borne most heavily by Appalachia's non-white populations. Free black farming communities that had tilled the same soil since the 1700s were branded as mongrels. Cherokee families who had hidden in the coves during the Trail of Tears were written out of local history. German and Swiss pacifist clans who had fled war and settled fertile valleys were folded, without consent, into a militaristic Scots-Irish narrative. The silence in the archives has finally been broken, not by one discovery, but by the slow, relentless accumulation of genetic data and overlooked paper trails. When geneticists sequenced the Y chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA of over 1,000 Appalachian families in the 2010s, the results shattered the single origin myth. Instead of a clean Ulster signature, they found a mosaic. Northern English borderland markers made up nearly 60% of the deep mountain gene pool. Palatinate German markers accounted for another 20 to 30%. Cherokee and other southeastern Native American ancestry appeared in about 1 in 4 families. Sub-Saharan African ancestry was quietly present in a real minority of white-identifying mountain families, and the classic Ulster Scots component, the piece of the story that had been claimed as the whole thing, turned out to be a smaller share than anyone had ever been told. Appalachia was never a Scots-Irish homeland. It was America's original melting pot, a British-German Native African composite that was then folk-remembered as Scots-Irish, because that was the identity that carried the highest social status in the frontier South. The DNA evidence does not diminish Appalachian identity. It shows that Appalachian identity was always broader, older, and more complicated than the folk story allowed. And the mountains, if you know how to listen, have been trying to tell that longer truth for 200 years. Only now, finally, are we able to hear it.